The assembly hall of Sorvith Prime had been designed, at considerable expense, to make every occupant feel simultaneously significant and small. This was not an accident. The architects, a collective from the Meridian Belt, whose portfolio included 3 planetary parliaments and 1 famously uncomfortable opera house, had understood their brief with precision. The ceiling rose to a height that required its own atmospheric regulation. The floor was pale stone, quarried from the moon of a world whose name most of the delegates present could not pronounce without practicing first. Along the curved walls, the environmental systems maintained a temperature that was comfortable for 11 of the 12 represented species, and slightly too warm for the Delvari, who had been complaining about this since the first session and would, in all likelihood, be complaining about it long after the current matter was resolved. The current matter was not resolved. This was the 3rd session convened on the subject, a fact that the session coordinator, a precise and increasingly tired man named Orvith, had noted in the official record with the kind of neutral language that, between its lines, communicated something closer to despair. The first session had ended in careful ambiguity. The second had ended in careful ambiguity wearing slightly different phrasing. The third was now following a trajectory that suggested it intended to honor this tradition completely. Queen Victoria stood at the dais. She was not a small woman, and the dais did nothing to diminish her further. She had the posture of someone who had stopped needing architecture to make a point on her behalf sometime in her early 30s. Her hair was dark, pulled back with the kind of severe elegance that suggested it had not been arranged so much as commanded into position. She wore no crown. The Sorvith did not use crowns. They considered them, as a category, to be a somewhat on-the-nose approach to the concept of authority, a view they held with the particular confidence of people who had been making this observation for several hundred years. She spoke without hesitation, and without the softening qualifications that a more self-conscious speaker might have reached for. Her daughter remained unbetrothed. The Confederation had extended the consideration period through 2 previous assemblies. The silence that had followed both announcements had been, she said, received and noted. She was noting it again now, for the record, in the interest of clarity. The silence that followed this statement was immediate and thorough. 12 delegations arranged in concentric arcs produced, collectively, the sound of people who had developed, through long practice, the ability to make their faces say absolutely nothing. The Delvari representative shifted slightly in his seat, which may have been discomfort at the temperature or a response to the announcement. It was, as usual with the Delvari, difficult to determine. The delegate from the Arren Compact studied his data tablet with the focused attention of a man who had just discovered it contained something absolutely fascinating, which it did not. Lucas was sitting in the 3rd row. He had been assigned the 3rd row because the seating allocation for human liaison officers placed them there by default, a positioning that reflected, with reasonable accuracy, where human liaisons tended to rank in the broader architecture of interplanetary diplomacy. He had attended all 3 sessions. He had taken notes at the first 2, a habit he had since reconsidered, given that the notes from both sessions were, when compared, nearly identical. He was not taking notes now. He was sitting with the particular stillness of someone whose internal process had just reached a conclusion that the rest of him had not yet been informed about. He was aware of the silence in the room. He was aware of its weight, its duration, the way it had moved in the last 30 seconds from uncomfortable to something that had started to feel, to him, like a condition he was no longer willing to simply occupy. He thought about the protocol for what he was considering. He was aware there was one. He was aware he did not know what it was. He stood up. The movement was not dramatic. He did not push back his chair with any particular force. He simply stood in the 3rd row among 12 delegations and their careful expressions, in a room whose ceiling required its own weather system, and said Sira's name in the form of a question. Just the name, just to confirm in front of everyone that he had the correct person in mind. Then he said he would like to be considered. The silence that followed this was a completely different kind of silence from the one that had preceded it. It had texture. It had direction. It moved through the room like a shift in pressure. Queen Victoria looked at him from the dais. Her expression traveled visibly, and in sequence through surprise, through something sharper than surprise, and then settled into an expression that her senior advisors, had any of them been in a position to observe it closely, would have recognized as the one she wore when she encountered something that required her full attention. It was not a warm expression. It was not an unwelcoming one. It was the expression of a woman who had just seen something she intended to verify was actually there before she decided what to do with it. Orvith, the session coordinator, looked down at his records. Then he looked up. Then he wrote something down slowly, with the air of a man adding a new category to a document that had not previously required one. The private chamber adjacent to the assembly hall had been designed for exactly this kind of conversation, which is to say, it had been designed for difficult conversations between important people who needed a room that communicated, through its furnishings and proportions, that whatever was being discussed in it was serious. It had a long table. It had chairs that were comfortable without being inviting. It had a window that looked out over the lower city of Sorvith Prime, where the transit lines ran in luminous threads between towers that caught the late light of the system's sun and held it in their glass faces like a slow argument about architecture. Lucas had been escorted here by two people who had not introduced themselves, which he took as a sign that the introduction was considered unnecessary given the circumstances. He had walked between them with the composure of a man who had made a decision in public and was now in the process of discovering what that decision weighed. He did not have to wait long. Queen Victoria entered without ceremony, which is to say she entered the way she did everything, with the kind of self-possession that made ceremony feel, by comparison, like a thing that needed her permission to exist. She did not bring advisors. She did not bring the two officials who had escorted Lucas, who remained outside the closed door, presumably standing in the corridor with the professional patience of people trained to wait without leaning on walls. She sat across from him. She looked at him. She said nothing for a moment that was long enough to be intentional. Then she asked him what precisely he imagined he was doing. Lucas considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was considerable. He said he was aware that he had not followed protocol. She said that this was one way to describe it. He said he was also aware that he did not have a formal standing to make the offer he had made, that his position as a human liaison officer did not carry the kind of diplomatic weight that the situation would ordinarily require, and that he had stood up before any of these considerations had fully completed their circuit through his thinking. Victoria looked at him. She said that this was, in her experience, an unusual thing for a person to admit. He said he found that other approach, the one where a person pretended they had thought everything through, generally took longer and arrived at the same place. There was a pause. It was not an unfriendly pause. It was the pause of a woman recalibrating something. She had expected, she told him, one of three things. She had expected ambition dressed in generous language. She had expected a political calculation from the human delegation that someone had decided to execute through the least expected available vessel. She had expected, at minimum, a prepared statement of some kind, something that indicated the move had been rehearsed, coordinated, sanctioned by someone above him in a hierarchy that had decided this was worth attempting. Lucas said he could check with his hierarchy if she wanted, but he was reasonably confident their reaction to what he had done was going to be somewhere in the range of profound institutional surprise. Victoria said that this was not as reassuring as he perhaps intended it to be. He agreed that it probably wasn't. Outside the window, a transit line completed its arc between two towers in a quiet streak of blue light, and the lower city moved through its evening with the specific indifference of cities that have existed long enough to have seen most things before. Sorvith Prime was old. Not old in the way that some worlds performed oldness, with ruins and preserved sites and informational placards, but old in the way that settled into the stone of a place and stayed there, in the weight of the air, in the way the light fell. Victoria asked him why he had done it, not what he had been thinking, not what he hoped to gain. Why? Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the silence in the room had reached a quality that he personally found difficult to sit inside, and that her daughter's situation had struck him, across 3 sessions of careful diplomatic nothing, as a problem that was being made worse by the specific way everyone was being very polite about it. Victoria studied him with an expression that had moved past the phase of determining whether he was a threat and into something more methodical. The expression of someone constructing an accurate picture of a thing they had not previously had cause to look at directly. She said that his reasoning was not a qualification. He said he knew that. She said that Sorvith customs around betrothal carried a weight that most off-world visitors understood theoretically and underestimated practically, and that what he had done in that assembly hall would have consequences for his standing, his delegation standing, and the general shape of his professional future regardless of what she decided. He said he understood that too. She asked if there was anything he had thought through before standing up. He said he had thought that the silence needed to stop. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Through the window, the city's lights were beginning to assert themselves against the dimming sky, the transit lines brightening, the towers shifting from gold to something cooler and more certain. She told him she would not be making any decisions this evening. She told him she found his answers, if not sufficient, then at least honest in a way she had not anticipated. She told him that she would arrange for him to meet Sira, and that this meeting would be described in all official records as informal, and that he should understand the precise and specific weight that word was carrying when she used it. Lucas said he understood. She stood. He stood. She looked at him one final time with that same expression, verifying still that the thing she was seeing was actually there. Then she left, and he stood alone in the room with the long table and the window and the city arranging its lights below him, thinking that he should probably send his supervisor a message before someone else did. Sira had not been present at any of the 3 sessions. This was not an oversight. It was a position she had arrived at through careful reasoning and communicated to her mother's staff with a clarity that had left very little room for negotiation, which was, the staff had learned over time, the only kind of clarity Sira produced. She had made her view known once, in writing, in a document that was 2 paragraphs long and required no follow-up questions because it had anticipated them and addressed them in advance. The document had been filed. The sessions had proceeded without her. She had considered this a satisfactory outcome. She had not anticipated Luca's. No one had anticipated Luca's, which was, Sira had concluded after thinking about it for the better part of an evening, precisely the problem with him. He did not fit any of the categories she had constructed for this situation, and she had constructed several. She had built them carefully over the course of 2 previous sessions, based on the available data, the delegate profiles, the political alignments, the specific texture of the silence that kept following her mother's announcements. She had been, she felt, quite thorough. She had not included a category for a human liaison officer from the 3rd row with no apparent mandate, and a willingness to say a thing out loud that everyone else in the room had decided, collectively and without discussion, not to say. This was irritating. She was willing to acknowledge that privately. The meeting her mother had arranged was held in one of the smaller reception rooms on the residential level of the Sorvith diplomatic complex, a room that communicated informality through its proportions and furnishings in the way that all rooms on this level communicated things, deliberately, and with significant attention to detail. There were no long tables. There were chairs that were actually comfortable. There was a low shelf along one wall that held a collection of objects from various worlds, some of them gifts, some of them purchases, one of them an accident of acquisition that had never been fully explained. Sierra was already in the room when Lucas arrived. She was standing near the window, not looking out of it, but near it, in the way of someone who had positioned herself with some thought about where she wanted to be when the door opened. She was tall, and her ears traced their long, elegant lines through dark hair that she wore without any of the formal arrangement her mother's state appearances required. She was not in formal dress. She was wearing something practical, in a dark material that the light treated with complete indifference, and she was looking at Lucas with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, skepticism and the specific attention of someone who intended to form an accurate opinion, and was already in the process of doing so. She did not offer a greeting immediately. She looked at him for a moment that was long enough to be deliberate, and then she said, without particular hostility but also without any softening, that she wanted to understand why he had done it. Not, she said, the diplomatic answer, the actual one. Lucas said he wasn't sure the diplomatic answer and the actual one were very different in this case. She said she would be the judge of that. He said that was fair. He told her the same thing he had told her mother, in largely the same words, because they were the true words and he did not have a different set. He said the silence had reached a quality he found difficult to sit inside. He said that 3 sessions of careful nothing had struck him as a process that was making the situation worse rather than better. He said he had not thought through the full consequences before standing up, and that he was aware this was not a ringing endorsement of his judgment. Sierra looked at him. She said that it was not, no. Then she said that it was also not what she had expected him to say, and that she was reserving her opinion on whether that was a point in his favor or simply a data point that didn't yet fit anywhere. Lucas said that seemed reasonable. She moved away from the window and sat, and after a moment he sat as well, and the room settled into something that was not comfortable exactly but was at least honest, which Sierra had long ago decided she preferred to the alternative. She asked him what he knew about Sorvith. He told her, accurately, and without embellishment, what he knew, which was a working familiarity with the Confederation's engineering infrastructure, a partial understanding of its political structure, and an admission that his knowledge of its customs was theoretical in the way that her mother had already identified, and that he was not going to pretend otherwise. Sierra said that was more than most people admitted to knowing, which was a low bar, but still. He said he'd take it. She almost did something with her expression at that. It was brief, and she redirected it efficiently, but it had been there. She asked him what he did, specifically, as a liaison. He explained. She asked 2 follow-up questions that indicated she had understood his explanation and found one part of it worth examining further. He answered them. She asked a 3rd question that moved the conversation into the territory of faster-than-light routing infrastructure, which was not where he had expected the conversation to go, and he said so. She said that most conversations did not go there because most people could not follow them there. He said he would do his best. She said she would adjust accordingly if he got lost. He did not get lost. This appeared to register with her in some way she did not comment on directly, but the quality of the conversation shifted after that, not warmer precisely, but more level, as though she had made an internal adjustment to the parameters she was working with. They talked for a while longer about things that were not the reason he was there, and then about things that were, and Sierra asked her questions with the directness of someone who had never once confused politeness with honesty and did not intend to start. When the meeting ended, she did not tell him what she had concluded. She told him she had found the conversation worth having, which she said with the particular care of someone for whom this represented a specific and non-trivial thing to say. Lucas said he had too. She nodded once and he left, and Sierra stood in the room after the door had closed and looked at the wall of objects from various worlds, and thought that she was going to need a new category. The weeks that followed, did not resemble a courtship in any framework that either of them had a word for. They did not have a word for it because no existing word had been built to cover the specific territory they were moving through, which was somewhere between a negotiation, a series of increasingly honest arguments, and something that neither of them was yet willing to name directly, which suited them both for reasons they had not discussed. They met in the small reception room 4 more times before anyone suggested moving to a different location. The suggestion came from Sira, who said that she was beginning to associate the room with the specific quality of its chairs, which were comfortable in a way she found, over time, slightly suspicious. Lucas said he had not considered the possibility of distrusting furniture before, but was willing to examine it. She said that was not what she meant. He said he knew. She moved them to a working space on the research level of the complex, a room with long benches and equipment she used for her work in Confederation transit modeling. And this turned out to suit them considerably better because it gave them something to stand next to and point at when the conversation required it, which their conversations increasingly did. Sira worked in transit modeling the way she did everything else, with a thoroughness that did not announce itself and a precision that emerged only when you were paying close enough attention to notice it. She was mapping inefficiencies in the faster-than-light relay network that connected the Confederation's outer settlements to its core systems, a project she had been developing for 2 years, and that her mother's advisors had described in official communications as promising, which was the word they used when they wanted to indicate support without committing to understanding. Lucas understood it. This continued to be a fact that she processed slowly and with some resistance, because it kept not fitting the picture she had initially constructed of him, and she did not enjoy revising pictures. He had a working knowledge of FTL infrastructure from 3 years of liaison work on the Meridian Belt's routing disputes, a period of his career he described as educational in the specific way that things were educational when they were mostly unpleasant. She asked questions about the disputes. He answered them. She asked follow-up questions that indicated she had immediately identified the part of his answers that contained the most interesting problem. He said she was very fast at that. She said she had noticed that people often found it off-putting. He said he didn't. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she was adding something to a running internal account and said nothing. Their conversations had a particular rhythm that established itself without either of them deciding on it. They would begin with something concrete, a section of her modeling work, a question about the Confederation's outer relay stations, a specific technical disagreement they had left unresolved from the previous meeting, and then move, through some mechanism neither of them had mapped, into territory that was less concrete and more personal, and then arrive somewhere that was neither exactly, but that had the quality of both. Sira noticed this pattern on the 3rd session in the research room and said so, because she had never seen any advantage in pretending not to notice things. Lucas said he had noticed it too. She asked if he found it inconvenient. He said he found it interesting. She said those were not mutually exclusive. He said he was aware of that. He sent his supervisor the message he had promised himself he would send on the evening of the first assembly, 5 days after the fact, because he had been composing it in his head for 5 days and it had not improved. The message explained the situation with the accuracy of someone who had decided that accuracy was the only viable approach, and it was received, after a silence of several hours, with a response that contained 3 sentences. The first acknowledged the information. The second noted that this was outside the standard parameters of liaison activity. The third said that he should keep them informed. He told Sira about this. She said 3 sentences was more than she would have predicted. He said he had also thought it was more than he deserved. She said her mother had received a communication from the human delegation's senior coordinator that had been considerably longer than 3 sentences and had required 2 rounds of diplomatic translation, not for language reasons, but because the original had contained several phrases that the translators felt were not well served by direct rendering. Lucas asked what the phrases had said. Sierra said she had been told only that they communicated significant institutional surprise. He said that tracked. She laughed. It was brief, and she did not make an event of it, but it was genuine, and it arrived without her having prepared for it, which meant she had not had the opportunity to be measured about it. And Lucas noted this with the care of someone who understood it was not a small thing. The humor between them had developed in the way that humor developed between people who were both precise by disposition. Not through performance, not through the trading of rehearsed observations, but through the specific comic potential that emerged when two people were being very exact about something, and the exactness itself became funny. Sierra had a dry wit that surfaced without warning and then retreated just as quickly, as though she was not entirely sure she wanted to be caught enjoying the joke. Lucas had the kind of humor that did not require an audience, which meant he found things funny whether or not anyone else was going to. And this turned out to be, for Sierra, something she found unexpectedly difficult to ignore. She had told him, by the end of the fourth meeting in the research room, more about the transit modeling project than she had told anyone outside of her immediate research circle. She had not decided to do this. It had happened through the accumulation of conversations that kept moving in that direction, because he kept asking the right questions. And she had concluded, after examining the situation with her characteristic rigor, that the right questions were not something a person performed. Either you were actually interested or you were not, and the questions knew the difference. She had added this to the running account. The account was getting long. Victoria had been watching. This was not unusual. Watching was, in many respects, the central skill of her position. Not the speeches, not the ceremonies, not the 17 diplomatic crises she had navigated with varying degrees of grace, but the watching. The ability to observe a situation across time, to resist the temptation of early conclusions, to let a thing develop until it showed you what it actually was rather than what it appeared to be in its first moments. She had been doing this for long enough that it had become, as most practiced skills eventually did, invisible to her. Not an effort but a condition, like breathing, like the particular awareness of a room's temperature that told you, without your having to think about it, whether something had changed. She had been watching Lucas for 5 weeks. She had done this without announcing it, which would have been unlike her, and without making it obvious, which would have been unprofessional. She had received reports from her staff, not because she had requested surveillance specifically, but because her staff understood without being told that she would want to know. The reports were factual and brief, in the format she had trained her people to use over years of working together, and they told her where Lucas had been, what rooms he had been in, how long the meetings had lasted, and occasionally what topics had been discussed when those topics were relevant to Confederation interests. The reports had become, over 5 weeks, interesting in a way that official reports rarely were. She requested a separate meeting with one of her senior advisors, a woman named Davy who had been with her for 11 years, and who had the specific quality of being willing to say the thing that the room was avoiding. Victoria asked her what the staff's general assessment was. Davy said that the honest answer was that no one had expected the meetings to continue past the second one, and that there was now a quiet and unresolved debate among the senior staff about what category of situation they were in. Victoria asked what the categories under debate were. Davy listed them with the composure of someone who had prepared for this question. Victoria listened. Then she asked which category Davy personally assigned to the situation. Davy said she thought they were in a category that did not have a name yet, and that this was, in her experience, usually the most significant kind. Victoria thanked her and did not discuss it further, which Davy understood to mean that the conversation had given Victoria what she needed, and that the next moves were being considered in a part of her thinking that she did not share. She called Lucas to the private chamber a second time on a Tuesday, which was notable only because the first meeting had also been on a Tuesday, which was either a coincidence or a preference she had not examined closely enough to know. She entered the room the same way she had before, without ceremony, without staff, and sat across from him, and looked at him with the expression that had become, since the first meeting, something she was more practiced at reading. She told him she had expected by now to have found something. He asked what kind of something. She said the kind that made the decision easy. The ambition, the calculation, the motive that sat behind the honest answers and explained them as performance. She had been doing this work for a long time, and she had found that thing in most people eventually. Not because most people were dishonest, but because most people wanted something specific, and wanting something specific left a shape in how a person moved through a situation, a curvature in their trajectory that became visible over time. She had not found the shape in him. Lucas said that he could try to develop a hidden agenda if it would be more comfortable for everyone involved. He said he was open to suggestions on what it should be if she had any. Victoria looked at him. Something moved through her expression that was not quite amusement and not quite exasperation, and was, in the specific combination it produced, something she had not felt in a professional context in some time. She told him she was annoyed that he kept doing that. He asked what specifically. She said giving her an honest answer, and then undercutting the weight of it with something that made it difficult to respond to formally. He said he wasn't aware he was doing it as a strategy. She said she was aware he wasn't aware, and that this was, in its own way, the most inconvenient version of the problem. She told him she had not come to a decision. She told him she was not a person who came to decisions before the evidence warranted it, and that 5 weeks of observation had given her clarity on some things and left others still open. She said that what she had clarity on was that he was not what she had expected, and that what remained open was what that meant for Sira, which was the only question that actually mattered. Lucas said he understood that. She said she was not sure he understood it fully. That Sira had spent years in a situation that had been shaped by other people's decisions about what she was, and what she needed, and what the appropriate framework for her life was supposed to look like, and that another person deciding something on her behalf, even with good intentions, was not a neutral act just because the intentions were good. Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he wasn't trying to decide anything on Sira's behalf. He said that Sira was, in his experience of her, a person who was entirely capable of deciding things for herself, and that what he had done in the assembly hall had not been a decision about Sira but a decision about the silence, and that he understood there was a difference, and that the difference mattered. Victoria looked at him for a long time. Outside, the transit lines ran their quiet arcs through the city's evening, the light moving in steady threads between towers that had stood long enough to have watched many things begin and some of them end. The system sun had moved behind the horizon, and the city's own light was doing what it always did, rising to fill the space that the larger light had left, patient and practiced, and entirely sufficient. She told him that she had not expected to have this conversation, and that she was glad she had. She said it in the tone of a person making an admission they had decided, after consideration, was accurate enough to be worth making. Then she said she thought he should know that Sira had mentioned him, the previous evening, in a conversation that had not been about him and had arrived there anyway. She did not tell him what Sira had said. She did not need to. The fact of it was the thing she had wanted him to have, and she watched it land in him with the attention of a woman who had been watching things for a very long time and knew, by now, what it looked like when something was real. Sira found him in the research room. This was not unusual by the 6th week. He had developed a habit of arriving there in the late afternoon with the specific air of someone who was not waiting for anything in particular, which was, they had both silently agreed, a more honest description of what he was doing than the alternative. He was looking at the transit modeling display when she came in, a three-dimensional rendering of the Confederation's outer relay network that floated above the central bench in soft blue light, all its inefficiencies mapped in amber threads that pulsed at irregular intervals like something trying to draw attention to itself. Sierra looked at the display, then at him, then said that he had moved one of the relay markers. He said he had been looking at the outer Veth corridor and thought the positioning was off. She came to stand beside him and looked at where he had moved it. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was examining something seriously. Then she said he was right, and that she had been aware of the problem for 3 weeks and had not resolved it yet because the solution created a secondary inefficiency in the adjacent node that she found aesthetically offensive. Lucas said he had a possible approach to the secondary inefficiency. She said she was listening. He explained it. She asked 2 questions. He answered them. She moved 2 more markers, and the amber pulse in that section of the display steadied and then stopped, and they both looked at it in the specific silence of people who have just solved a problem that had been unsolved for 3 weeks, and the silence had a different quality from all the other silences that had occupied this room, because it was satisfied. Sierra said, without looking away from the display, that she had been thinking. He said he had gathered that. She said she wanted to tell him something, and that she was going to say it the way she said things, which was directly, and that she did not want him to respond until she had finished because she had found, in her experience, that people responding before she had finished generally resulted in everyone having a worse time. He said he understood. She told him that she had spent a significant portion of her adult life being a subject of discussion, rather than a participant in the conversations that concerned her. That the assembly sessions, all 3 of them, had represented a particular distillation of something she had been navigating for years. The experience of being present in a situation as a problem to be solved rather than a person doing the solving. That she had built in response to this a series of very precise walls, and that she was aware they were walls, and that she had constructed them deliberately and maintained them carefully and did not regret them. She said that he had not tried to take the walls down. She said this was the thing she had not expected, and that she had spent considerable time examining why it mattered, and that the conclusion she had arrived at was that most people, when they encountered a wall, either respected it from a distance in a way that became its own kind of distance, or they decided the wall was a challenge and oriented themselves toward it accordingly. She said he had done neither. He had simply been present on his side of the wall, doing the work, asking the questions, finding the secondary inefficiency in the outer Veth corridor offensive for the same reason she did, and the wall had become, over 6 weeks, less a wall and more a line she had drawn in a location she was now reconsidering. Lucas had not said anything, because she had told him not to, and because he understood that this was a thing she had built carefully in the telling, and that interrupting it would have been a specific kind of damage. She looked at him then and said that she had decided she wanted to find out what happened next. She said it plainly, without ceremony, in the tone of someone stating a conclusion they had reached through rigorous process. She said it was not a declaration, and she was not interested in performing it as one. It was a hypothesis, formed from available evidence, and she intended to test it with the same methodology she applied to everything else. Lucas said that sounded reasonable. She said she thought he might say that. He said that he wanted to tell her something as well, and she said she was listening. He said that when he had stood up in the assembly hall 6 weeks ago, he had not known what he was doing in any of the ways that mattered. He had known the mechanics stand, speak, state the thing. He had not known what it would cost him, or what it would open, or whether the instinct driving it was the kind worth following. He said that 6 weeks of finding out had been the most clarifying period of his professional and personal life, and that he was aware that was a significant statement, and that he was making it because she had just been direct with him, and he owed her the same currency. Sierra looked at him for a long moment. Then she said that currency was an unusual word for it. He said he was open to a better one. She said she would think about it. The transit display floated between them with its corrected amber threads, the outer Veth corridor running clean and steady now, the secondary inefficiency resolved, the whole network a little more coherent than it had been an hour ago. Sierra looked at it and said that the correction was going to require her to revise a significant portion of her modeling documentation. Lucas said he was sorry about that. She said she wasn't, and that she found it notable that a solution she had been avoiding for 3 weeks had arrived through a conversation she had not planned to have, and that this seemed, on reflection, consistent with the general shape of the last 6 weeks. He said the general shape of the last 6 weeks had been, on balance, good. She said on balance, yes. They stood together in the research room while the display turned slowly above the bench. The outer settlements and core systems of the Confederation connected by their luminous threads, all that distance made navigable by the careful placement of relay points that passed information across the dark at speeds that still struck Lucas, when he thought about it directly, as something close to miraculous. Sierra had once told him that faster-than-light communication was not miraculous, it was engineering. He had said the two were not mutually exclusive. She had considered this and said she supposed they weren't. Outside, Sorveth Prime was moving through its evening. The assembly hall on the lower level of the complex sat empty, its chairs in their concentric arcs, its atmospheric systems maintaining the temperature that was comfortable for 11 of the 12 represented species, and which the Delvari ambassador had, as of that morning, formally agreed to stop raising in written communications. A diplomatic development that Orvith, the session coordinator, had recorded in the official register with 3 exclamation points. A personal record. There would not be a 4th session. Victoria received the news from Sierra directly, in the same private conversation where Sierra told her the rest of it, and Victoria listened without interrupting, which was something she could do when it mattered. When Sierra had finished, Victoria said nothing for a moment. Then she said that she had seen it coming for approximately 4 weeks and had been waiting to see whether Sierra would arrive at it herself or whether she would need a nudge. Sierra asked what kind of nudge she had been considering. Victoria said she had thought about mentioning, casually, that Lucas had looked at the transit display in the research room during their second private meeting and asked an intelligent question about the outer Veth corridor. Sierra said that would have been a very transparent nudge. Victoria said that transparency, in the right context, was a form of respect. Sierra looked at her mother with the expression she wore when she was revising something, and said that she was going to remember that one. Victoria said she hoped so. The city's transit lines ran their quiet arcs through the dark outside the window, blue and steady, connecting point to point across distances that would have been, to an earlier version of this world, unimaginable. The system's sun was long gone, and the city's own light had taken the sky entirely, and Sorveth Prime sat in its place in the dark of the system, with the specific self-possession of something that had been here a long time and expected to remain. In the research room, the display turned. The amber threads held steady, and the silence, when it came, was the kind that didn't need filling, the kind that arrived not from the absence of something, but from the presence of enough.